Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We are very excited to have a new guest on the line, the great Joshua Meeks from the U.S. Naval War College. How are you, Joshua?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us. For those of you not familiar with Josh, he is a professor at the Naval War College, and he also has 2 books out on Amazon that I recommend you check out. Josh, can you give to the uninitiated kind of an overview of your career and the books?
Absolutely, yeah. I was a graduate student at Florida State and part of the Institute on Napoleon and the French Revolution, which really formed a lot of my early career in particular, and that led to my dissertation. Dissertation turned into the first book, which was on the struggle for the revolutionary Western Mediterranean, looking specifically at Britain and France and how they weaponized diplomacy and even ideology to a certain extent during the War of the First Coalition. So that was it was a great book. I had a lot of fun writing it, and I still have a deep love for the Mediterranean. And then from there, I got connected with Rauman Littlefield, who asked me to put together a reference guide for Napoleon and his life and works. And the way I approached that, it's essentially a single author encyclopedia was the way they pitched it, but I was like, that's not very fun. So what I did was think of it as a deconstructed biography that went alphabetical instead of chronological. So it's a short, smallish in terms of a biography of Napoleon. It's relatively short and svelte. And mostly used as a reference work. But it was a fun project to write as well.
I like that it's alphabetical order, and Waterloo kind of works perfectly for that.
It's a capstone, right? It absolutely is. And yes, then I got a job at the U.S. Naval War College, which is primarily teaching strategy. And it's a different type of history, right? Using history to think about strategy as opposed to using history for its own sake. So there's a different spin on what I do.
Well, what's interesting, and that's our topic for today, we're going to talk about Clausewitz and Jomini, who are 2 military strategists, and they were both really good readers, and they were both very good writers. And you would think, well, how can I learn strategy without being on the battlefield, right? But that's kind of what these 2 gentlemen did. I mean, they were on the battlefield, but they also read and wrote a lot.
I think some might quibble with Clausewitz being a good writer. He's turgid. His German prose is turgid at best. But no, I mean, I completely agree, right? And this is one of the things that not wrestle with, but engage with on a day-to-day basis in my job, which is talking about strategy, talking about theory, talking about this idea. And I don't have military experience myself, so I'm teaching military officers as an academic. And there is sometimes some innate skepticism that comes into that if you don't know what it is that you're talking about. As we could say with Clausewitz and Jomini, that they were on battlefields. I will say they were active duty on battlefields, getting engaged there, but they're not the principal military leaders of the day. They are the people who are thinking about the principal military leaders of the day.
Right. And I always kind of equated the guy behind the guy, kind of like Marshal Berthier. Like, you don't hear a lot about him, but he was the guy behind Napoleon.
Absolutely. And he also really didn't like Jomini. So
no, he did not. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Before we jump into the episode, Josh is going to read a little disclaimer for us.
Yep. I'm in an individual capacity. My views here do not represent the views of the Department of Defense, U.S. government, Department of the Navy, U.S. Naval War College, or anything therein. So yeah, that's
right. Thank you for that.
Just me here, not the Naval War College.
Just your views that going forward. Gotcha. Okay, so let's dive into their biographies really quick. It's funny, they're both born around the same time. Clausewitz was born July 1780 in Magdeburg, Prussia, and Jomini was born March 1779 in Switzerland. Their upbringings, nothing spectacular, I would say, right? And they just kind of both joined the army?
Yeah, well, so Clausewitz, he is a career, like he joins the army very early on. Like he is there, as a 13-year-old, right? Like his career is essentially always going to be that. Whereas Jomini is supposed to be a banker, right? That's what his dad wants him to be. That's what he goes to school for. And he ends up being a banker in Paris in, I think, 1796. But from an early age, he is fascinated by military ideas. He writes even at an early age of wanting to get involved in the military. But his dad wants him to be a banker, and he starts out doing that. But when he gets to Paris in 1796, as often happens in these moments of flux, he's there and opportunity presents itself. And he catches the eye of Marshal Ney, right? He catches the eye of people involved in the military and gets his ambition to join the military realized through really just not a predestined career in the way that Clausewitz was always going to be part of the military. Jomini comes in and says, I want this. And he
Right.
uses that ambition and uses really a way with words to become a military member and a part of the military, despite that in his early years, he wasn't necessarily destined for that in the same way that Clausewitz was.
Right. Yeah, I was reading about this and I found it interesting. First of all, people always say what a blockhead Marshall Ney was, but obviously the guy was reading and trying to learn strategy wherever he could. So Jomini publishes this book, and I think Ney actually helps him publish it and gives him money for it. And the interesting thing is Napoleon had Murray, one of his ministers, read it to him, and he said, quote, "Here is a young battalion commander, a Swiss at that, who teaches us what my teachers never taught me and what very few generals understand. But my entire system of war, we must seize this book and prevent it from spreading," end quote. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah. And that is what Jomini does early on and constantly, is he thinks and he writes. And he is quite good at that, right? There's some criticisms we can eventually level at Jomini, but in terms of his observations, he's sitting there, again, not with a lot of military training, just as a keen, intelligent, and dedicated observer of the Napoleonic military system. And as he writes ideas, suggestions, engagements with it, the people who are in that military system read it and say, that's high quality. That is worthwhile.
Yeah, and he eventually becomes chief of staff to Marshal Ney. We'll come back to him in a minute. With Clausewitz, I think it's also interesting. He had a very influential guy, a tutor, much like the great generals do, and that's General Scharnhorst, who again is a reformer. He wants to make over the Prussian military after their defeat at Jena-Auerstadt. And he learned, I think, for 3 years under this Scharnhorst, who's one of the best generals in the Prussian army.
Absolutely. There's some people who argue, and I don't necessarily disagree with this, that later on Clausewitz gets this label as a prophet of Napoleon, an apologist for Napoleon, someone who uses Napoleon as this exemplar of what military strategy should be. And he does. When you read Clausewitz, you're like, wow, he was clearly deeply influenced by Napoleon. A lot of that is actually, I would read it as not putting himself in Napoleon's shoes or in Napoleon's staff. It's putting himself in Scharnhorst's shoes and on Scharnhorst's staff, which is where he actually was. So when he thinks of the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic age, he's largely thinking of it almost as from an opposition's perspective, because of this experience that he has deep in the Prussian military establishment.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be learned, obviously, from Napoleon. The guy won 60 battles and lost, 8? And I think Jomini and Clausewitz both had the opportunity to work under Napoleon at one point in their career, the Russian invasion, and Jomini more than that. So I think they both learned from a master of warfare, which was Napoleon, right?
They did. Though an interesting contrast, almost in a personality aspect here, is that Jomini is, I'm not going to say mercenary. Mercenary is the wrong word, but he is someone who cares more about his ideas being listened to and less about any fealty to a specific state. Later on, he will kind of say, like, hey, I really don't want to invade Switzerland, right? I don't think that's a good idea.
Right.
I'm Swiss, right? Like, let's not do that. But for the most part, he's like, okay, the French are listening to me, so that's where I'm going to spend my career. When the French stop listening to him, he goes to someone who will listen to him, which is the Russians. Right? He doesn't care that much about the ideological polarization that's going on in the Napoleonic Wars. Whereas Clausewitz does. When Prussia allies with France, kind of that forced alliance after in 1806, that's when he goes and joins the Russians. He's like, I don't want to be with Napoleon. I don't agree with the Napoleonic conquests. I will put myself opposite Napoleon wherever that might be. And obviously, for a time, it's almost nowhere. He doesn't go to Britain, right? He doesn't go that far. He doesn't speak English, I don't think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of the wheels fall off for both Jomini and Clausewitz after the Russian invasion. Jomini's arguing with Marshal Ney more often. Jomini, I believe, was going to be promoted by Marshal Ney, I think after, was it Bautzen or Lutzen, one of those. And Marshal Berthier, in his typical bickering ways, denied it and then ordered Jomini to be arrested for not sending in, I think, a troop status report on time.
Yeah, which is, it depends. And this is one of those that, if you read Jomini, he's like, what trumped up charges, right? This is completely ridiculous. How dare. I would I think there is some merit to Jomini not actually doing a great job at the tail end of the Russian invasion, right? Like he's distracted. He's not doesn't do a great job. Does he deserve to be arrested? Probably not. There's some personality issues that come in with Ney and Berthier as well there. But ultimately, yeah, regardless of whose side you want to believe in terms of how big of a deal it was, his name was struck from the promotion list. He was arrested briefly, and largely not discredited from his ideas, but discredited as a effective general. Right? I mean, he's a general.
Yeah. Yeah, and I read General Marbeau's memoirs, and Jomini changes sides. He goes over to the Russians. Now, we'll get into it why it's not necessarily turncoating, because he had a commission. Was it the Russian army?
Yeah.
Or he had a dual commission. So it wasn't necessarily, but still to the French, it's like, well, you're leaving us.
Yeah, and you're leaving us. It's not that you're leaving us when we're allies.
Yeah.
You're leaving for the Russians after we're clearly like that dual commission, that kind of somewhat. And I think actually Jomini somewhat oversells the amount to which I think he did have a dual commission, but it was not. He paints it as he was this hot commodity, right? When Jomini writes about this, he says, I was this hot commodity. The Russians wanted me, the French wanted me, everybody wanted Jomini. And so then the French didn't want him. So he's like, so I went to where the money was. I went to where the interest was. They still want me. I'm going there.
Right.
I think that's overselling it a bit. And especially in terms of how engaged the Russians were with trying to get Jomini from the French. I think of it in sports terms, right? He's not actually a free agent who's this hot commodity. It's almost like the French waive him, and then the Russians pick him up off of waivers.
Pick him up. Right? That's a good analogy. Yeah, but you look at was it Dresden? All right. So Tsar Alexander's like, all right, I can't beat Napoleon. I want to get Bernadotte in there. I want to get Moreau in there. I want to get Jomini in there. Like, I want to get his guys who know how to beat him working on my team.
Absolutely. Yep. And Jomini does have a reputation, again, not as this brilliant field commander, but as a brilliant thinker, as someone who does know the systems incredibly well. And so his value to the Russians was never going to be, win this battle for me. It was going to be a systematic, like understanding the system that Napoleon was able to employ so brilliantly. And you can see that even very quickly he gets involved, not just in, staff work and leading troops. He gets involved in education, right? That's one of his primary roles when he gets involved in Russia is figure out the best way to teach these theories, to teach these ideas, because that's your strength.
All right. So now we'll just jump ahead. Napoleon obviously loses 1814, 1815 again at Waterloo. So the Napoleonic Wars are over. So then there's all these memoirs that come out. There's analysis. And then Clausewitz's book, which is actually published by his widow, right? He's just working on it. And he dies of cholera, I think, in 1831. So he dies before he gets to really pull it together, right? Is that kind of how it comes out?
Absolutely. He is call it a perfectionist, but he's constantly refining his work, right? On War, his big book, he is constantly refining it to up until his death. And so when he passes away before his time, really, his wife, Marie, she takes it and edits it, finishes it in a lot of ways. And there's some debate there of how much are we reading Clausewitz,
Marie's work,
how much are we reading Marie. I'll put a plug in from one of my colleagues here at the Naval War College. Vanya Bellinger is one of the experts on Marie Clausewitz, and she's excellent. I highly recommend her work if you're interested in Marie Clausewitz. But regardless, right, his book comes out posthumously, and it is finished, right? We can now dig deep and say, like, oh, that looks like one of those parts that was unfinished. But it is a complete work, right? There's elements that I would have liked. I know he would have developed further, even in terms of things like not quite insurgency, but counterinsurgency. But he has thoughts on small wars. He has thoughts on things that are not fully developed on war, that in a alternate world in which he has a long and healthy life, he's going to write more, and he's going to flesh out these ideas.
So with that said, Jomini does have a long life. He advises a few Russian czars. He also comes back to France, which is shocking to me, and advises Napoleon III in his Italian campaign. So he gets to have that full life and really flesh out his works, correct?
He does. Flesh out is one way to say it. He does refine his work, right? He does continually refine his work. But there's a question of whether he does that in pursuit of perfection or whether he does that in pursuit of publication. Because he is, every time he makes a new, his main work, called The Art of War, not to be confused with Sun Tzu, but the Summary of the Art of War, Précises on the Art of War. There are so many editions. I want to say it's well over 10 editions. I think it's close to 20 editions that are not that distinct. So there's this argument I kind of buy into a little bit, that Jomini's refinement of his work is not quite the same as when you see Clausewitz refining his work and not even publishing it. It's because he's pursuing perfection, whereas Jomini, he's like, no, I'll make a tweak here or there. I'll edit this, I'll change that, and resell it and get money.
So is that George Lucas making minor changes to Star Wars and pumping it back out?
I think a little bit, right? He is again, there's not mercenary. I do think that's the wrong word, but Jomini is not just concerned about the purity of the work. He's concerned about his own reputation, right? He's concerned about maintaining that reputation, and he does have, because he lives that long life. Also, something I think is worth noting, because he writes in French and then is translated to English. Clausewitz does not write in French or English, and it takes a while for him to be translated. He writes in German. It is somewhat turgid at times, and Jomini is popular. In the 19th century in particular, he forms and shapes his own popularity. Props to him, right? Like, I'm not going to begrudge him that. But when we look at their relative importance and weight over the course of their careers, those two factors are pretty important. One, Clausewitz dies. And the second being that, again, Clausewitz is writing to a Prussian world, and the Prussian world in 1820 is not particularly important or impressive. It's only when Bismarck comes around and people are like, whoa, 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 what are these Prussians reading? Right? And they're like, oh, they're reading this weird Clausewitz guy. Let's see if there's value.
And Jomini dies in 1869 in France, oddly enough, lives out his life there. But even when the two were alive at the same time, they didn't always agree with each other. And we're going to kind of get into the differences here. I'm going to talk about philosophy of war first. And these are just bullet points for me. Clausewitz's theory on philosophy of war: war is a continuation of politics by other means, emphasizes war's chaotic, unpredictable political nature, and views war shaped by moral forces, chance, and friction. Whereas Jomini says, no, war is more of a science governed by principles and formulas, focuses on geography, logistics, and lines of operation. Love logistics, by the way. And believes in universal principles that can guide generals to victory.
So as an aside here, I have heard this said, though I haven't tracked it down, that Jomini actually essentially invents the word logistics.
I've heard that too, yeah.
I haven't done the deep dive to track it and say, no, it's here. I don't have a strong opinion on that, but he's a logistics guy.
It's interesting that, principles where any generals can win. I mean, there's good generals and bad generals, as we know in history, but if you can focus on logistics like the Duke of Wellington did, you give yourself a better chance of winning.
Absolutely. And so that's a really good way of nuancing Jomini, because I do think that Jomini, and I'll start with Jomini real quick here, because I think that Jomini gets his work is often viewed in caricature, that it is just science, right? It is just these general principles. It's a checklist. And if you follow the checklist, you're going to win. And I think that's an oversimplification, because he does acknowledge that war writ large as this big idea, this big thing, is more complex than a checklist can really give you, right? Like that it is affected by variables and factors that are going to be outside the control of the commander. He gets that, right? And that's something we generally associate more with Clausewitz, which is fair. But what Jomini does say is that battle, if we want to kind of put it simply, or strategy more writ large, like if you're asking the question of how do I win within these constraints, you can do a checklist, right? And that the result of that checklist is that it's going to give you, if you follow these principles, if you follow these formulas and this checklist, it is going to give you the best possible chance to achieve victory in war. Does it guarantee it? No. But it will give you that big leg up.
I think that's a great point. And Napoleon always talked about luck. Like, I want lucky generals. But what he meant by that was generals who did the hard work before the battle. But there is luck. There is the rainstorm the night before Waterloo. There's the snowstorm the middle of the Battle of Eylau that blinded Augereau's corps. So there's definitely things you cannot scientifically predict.
Absolutely. And then again, I speak against kind of this caricature of Jomini as just formulas, and that's part of what I think is often missed with his work. That being said, he does often emphasize formulas, and he does say war is, or strategy is a science, can be scientific, that there are right answers. And I think that's kind of the big distinction to make in how they are viewing war in general, is that Jomini would say, if you ask a question, there is almost always going to be a right answer to that question. And we might have to go through some branching koas, right? Like, it might get complex, but there is a right answer. Clausewitz, on the other hand, and this is something that we say in my classes all the time, Clausewitz says it depends, right? Like, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to give me an answer, but really, the answer 9 times out of 10 is it depends. And then you go into this, what does it depend on? Well, it depends on what it depends, right? It gets this incredibly murky, fuzzy, right? One of the phrases that we often associate with Clausewitz is the fog of war, and I like to think of,
Right.
we have the literal fog, that he's on some of these battlefields where fog is playing a pretty important role, and he is informed by that idea of fog and friction almost as literal things, even though he's thinking of them more conceptual in terms of what fog and friction are. But he breathes that in, that fog and friction are part of what strategy is.
Agreed. Let's talk theory versus application. As you mentioned, Clausewitz's book on war is often dense. It's hard to read, and it's unfinished. And it seeks to understand the nature of war, not just how to win. Jomini is more practical. His Art of War book outlines how to conduct campaigns and wrote with military officers and staff in mind, offering clear examples. Do you agree with that?
I do, and especially in the philosophical element that Clausewitz, I mean, he's a post-Enlightenment or even, intra-Enlightenment thinker. Like, he's writing essentially a Hegelian dialectical philosophical work about war. And that's one of the reasons that it is both harder to engage with and was hard. It took a while to pick up steam. It's also, I would argue, and we can talk about this later, but it's one of the reasons that it has persisted a little bit more than Jomini, is because it has that philosophical element that you can point to almost like, oh, I'll use this in this context, regardless of whether we're talking about space or whether we're talking about mountains and logistics, right? Like, it's widely applicable. And the other element that goes into that is, and this goes back to the previous point, but Clausewitz, when he says war is politics by other means, a continuation of politics, depends on how you translate it, but politics is flexible, right? Politics is variable. And so at its very foundational kind of philosophical level, he's saying, because war is determined by politics and is affected and always influenced by politics, it's always going to be fuzzy and a very human endeavor. And that leads to this abstraction, right? That it's all kind of theory and funny ideas, rather than here's the right answer.
Well, I think that's a great point. Back in college, I majored in political science, but politics, as you mentioned, it's murky. There's gray elements to it. So to extend politics through other means, it's just as murky.
There's some, when people write about Clausewitz in particular, one of the things that they note, which is an interesting, talking about academic circles even today, political science, strategic studies, and it's kind of odd bedfellows with political science, but they get along quite well. And one of the reasons that Clausewitz is difficult to use in strategic studies sometimes is because Clausewitz is so murky, right? We're not talking about independent variables, right? We're not going to be able to graph Clausewitz and bring a methods section down at the end of the paper. That's really hard to do using a Clausewitzian principles, if not impossible. It's not what he intended to do. But I think within that, there is, when thinking about theory versus application, it's an interesting almost terminology problem, because we use Clausewitz as theory, right? We say Clausewitz is is theoretical. And when we say those words today, we tend to kind of have this pie in the sky, abstract principles that are very theoretical. That's often actually not how Clausewitz and Jomini would have articulated it. Clausewitz would actually antagonize theory in a lot of ways, because theory is this framework through which we can get those right answers. And what Clausewitz is more interested in is this process, a broader process that can go in many different murky directions and is very ill-defined. Whereas Jomini this is the theory. The theory is this rules and principles and very, very direct and discrete and specific lessons that we can learn. So Jomini is practical to the nth degree, right? He only wants practicality.
Right. Well, this next point is, I want to talk about it after I go through the bullet points, but their respective views on the commander. Clausewitz emphasizes the role of genius, intuition, and judgment under uncertainty, and says great commanders adapt to changing conditions and political goals. Jomini idolizes systematic decision-making and clear strategic rules, and believes success depends on correctly applying set principles. The Duke of Wellington used to say this about Marshal Soult. He said he was a smart guy, but when he got to the battlefield, he was kind of like stuck in his battle plan and couldn't adapt to changes, and that's why Wellington always beat Soult. Like he couldn't move off of his plan once it was in motion, and I think that's what Clausewitz is kind of talking about here.
And it's fascinating, right? Because we have this question of Napoleon, right? Both of these thinkers look at Napoleon and are trying to say, why did Napoleon wipe the floor with us? Or he just wins. What is going on here? This doesn't make a great deal of sense in the arc and trajectory of European military history, right? This is an aberration. What's going on? Is it because, as Jomini would say, is it because Napoleon has perfected a system? He is such a strict adherent to his system, and his system is just better than any other system that exists right now. So it's a systems battle. And the better system, of course, the better system always wins. 4 is always greater than 3. There is no way that you can have 3 be greater than 4, right? It's a math equation, and it's simple, right? Why does Napoleon win? Because 4 is greater than 3. Done, right? Whereas what Clausewitz would say is what Napoleon does better. It's not the system. The system is brilliant. He doesn't begrudge that, right? But this is where Scharnhorst comes in, and he would say Scharnhorst has a great system. His reforms and his system is actually really impressive in its own way. And it's not that Napoleon just has the best system. He also has the best, Clausewitz would say the coup d'oeil, right? The commander's eye, that when he looks at the battlefield, he is seeing how to employ that system. And going to the previous point, he is one of the purest expressions of war and politics being intertwined and just being very healthy. Healthy maybe is the wrong word, because it's maybe unhealthy to have war and politics as entwined as they are in the person of Napoleon. But that's proof for Clausewitz that Napoleon is this genius. And the question then becomes not, how do you replicate genius? Because that's almost a fool's errand, right? You can't really replicate genius. What you can do is replicate the conditions in which the genius operates.
Well, I think that's what Jomini is saying. Like, I'm just going to follow the systems of the genius. Like, Josh Meeks and John Viscardo could take piano lessons from Mozart and Beethoven for 100 years and still not be as good on the piano. We're just, we don't have that talent. But I think that's what Jomini is saying is like, well, we can just study his systems and not worry about the genius that he has.
Yes, and that's true, and I think you're right. So what Germany is saying in essence is we want to create a system in which we don't need a genius to succeed. We have technicians. I had 2 sisters who played piano, not me. But one of them took piano for 12 years, and she was a technician at the piano, right? She could play a piece that was set in front of her. Another one was an artist, right? And she would have a temper tantrum and sit at the piano and compose a song. And when they played the same piece of music, you could tell the difference. I don't know how. I'm sure that musical theorists would say, but I'm a strategy theorist, and this is right where you can see the difference between someone who knows how to win a battle because they read the book and they're doing very good at that. That's a Jominian approach. And then you can see the geniuses, right? The people who have that particular eye and that artistic sense. And Clausewitz is saying that you can be an artist. I'm not saying you can be Van Gogh, right? But I'm going to try to teach you how to be an artist and to identify those incredibly flexible and dependent moments where you as the artist get to shape the canvas of the battlefield in your own way. Whereas Jomini is saying, I'm not going to teach you how to be an artist. I'm going to teach you how to be a technician, right? I'm going to teach you how to do things right.
Well, I think that was one of the great complaints about the marshals is people would say, "Well, why didn't Napoleon just teach the marshals how to do what he's doing?" And I don't. You can't teach genius, like we were saying.
Right. And that's an interesting, Clausewitz would agree, right, that you can't teach genius, but that you can allow for creativity. And you can
Mm.
create, if your system is such that it does not allow for and encourage creativity, it's going to be a worse system because it's not acknowledging the reality of the battlefield. And that's a huge distinction between them, is that Jomini is trying to eliminate the unknowns in any battlefield, and Clausewitz says that's a fool's errand. You cannot eliminate that blank space for the artist to create. And so what we should be doing is teaching people how to work within that blank space.
Yeah, it's interesting. Napoleon gave his marshals some independence, but he was also giving orders like all the way from Paris into Spain and Portugal, and it doesn't always work that way. If you have an independent guy, some were talented, Massena and Davout come to mind, but some were not, and you could see in the results.
Absolutely. And that this is what's great, right? Is that you can see how both thinkers are looking at the exact same situations and coming to very different conclusions about what is making this system work or fail. And both are right. It depends, right?
You're right. It depends. Yeah, murky again. Yeah. Okay, let's talk tactical and strategic emphasis. Clausewitz is less concerned with tactical specifics, more about the interplay between politics and strategy, and sees total war and limited war as parts of a spectrum. Jomini says there should be a strong focus on operational planning, interior lines, decisive points, and base of operations, and champions the idea of a Napoleonic concentration of force and maneuver.
And that's fair. Well, though Clausewitz is also, and if we're going to just take one of the Clausewitzian principles that really is equally a Jominian principle, it is concentrate your forces at the decisive point. The question then becomes, how do you determine the decisive point, and how do you concentrate your forces? And there are some differences in how they approach that, but the core idea of this is what you should be doing. This is the essence of what a battle is and a war is, even. That's shared between them. This is a little bit like when we talk about Mahan and Corbett as different, right? They're completely different naval theorists. They are more similar than different, but they do
Right.
have some fundamental differences about how they conceive of naval forces being employed, or land, and almost even the military in general, its function in war, as Clausewitz and Jomini would. Because you're right, Clausewitz is thinking of war as politics, as a continuation of politics, as an expression of politics. And Jomini's not opposed to that, but he would say once war happens, it's a math question. It's an equation that we can solve. And Clausewitz is never really comfortable with just making it into a simple equation. It's one of the famous ideas that we get from Clausewitz is the idea of the trinity or the triangle. And it's hotly debated of what exactly that is and how that's actually going to be manifested. But for our purposes, let's just say that it's the passion of the people, right? The realm of chance, and then rationality of the government. And that those three are always going to be and I shouldn't say government, but rationality in general. They're often associated with passion equals people, chance equals commander, and rationality equals government. So they get kind of connected in there, though I don't know that Clausewitz always argues. Again, it gets messy in there. But he puts those three in tension with each other constantly. And Jomini is saying, yeah, sure, there's chance, but let's eliminate that. Yeah, sure, there's
Right.
passion of the people. Put that off to the side. When you are winning, when you're fighting a war, the only thing that you're really concerned about is the military, the army, the logistics, the how do you determine the center of gravity? He doesn't call it that, the Schwerpunkt, but how do you identify that center point? How do you identify that? Call that a day, be done with it. That's your job. Don't worry
Right.
about those other factors.
You can kind of see where Napoleon's career started to fade. He got the two confused because he was a politician. He was an emperor, so he had to take concerns of borders and different kings and queens and princes. And before that, he was just a general, annihilating armies. But now he had to take in these other factors.
Absolutely, yeah. And I do think that there is a lot of, like, if you read the entirety of Clausewitz is often, and we do it in my own syllabus at the Naval War College, where we pick and choose, we say, this is what's relevant and this is what's not relevant. And in doing so, we kind of get this image of Clausewitz as this primarily political, strategic thinker with an eye towards operations, but not an operational tactical thinker. And I don't actually know that that's fair when you read the entirety of Clausewitz, because Clausewitz does go deep into some of the weeds of operations and tactics. That's just not his strength. That's not what you learn from Clausewitz. That's not what we take from Clausewitz. Whereas Jomini, when he writes, that's primarily what he's writing about. And he brings that insightful, again, almost just linguistic clarity. He's synthesizing a lot of different ideas and he's putting them on paper in a way that is still useful, right? When we're looking at operations, when we're looking at the logistics, lines of force, lines of operation, when we're looking at all of these things and we read what Jomini writes, that's his strength, and that's what he wants to be remembered for in a lot of ways. And so when you ask what are they trying to do, they're kind of trying to do different things in certain ways.
Right.
And so it's okay for us to read them together and not always in tension.
Well, let's talk lastly about their legacy and influence. I would say of the two, Clausewitz is probably the more famous in terms of books.
Today he is.
But maybe not then, yeah. So if we look at Clausewitz, he influenced modern strategic thought, political realism, 20th century military planning. He also studied in political science, military academies like yours, and leadership courses. Jomini dominated military education in the 19th century, especially the U.S. Civil War era, and is favored by generals seeking clarity and actionable guidance. Do you think that's accurate?
It is, absolutely. And it's one of the things we even wrestle with today, of the difference between training and education. And that's almost how I would put what happens with someone. When you learn from Jomini, you are being trained on how to operate on a battlefield. And when you learn from Clausewitz, you're being educated on how to think about a battlefield. And you might not be as well trained when you get there, but you're going to be a much more flexible thinker. And so then the question becomes, what is easier to fill in? Is it easier to have someone who's well trained be a good thinker, or is it easier for someone who's a good thinker to then fill in the training? And that's a difficult question even today.
Well, I think that's a great example of, these are two distinct things. What is the difference between strategy and tactics?
Absolutely.
What's your overall strategy of your campaign? And then when you get to the battlefield, what is your tactical overview?
Yeah. And that's when I teach my students, I'm trying to, I get 03s and 04s coming into the Naval War College, and we have conversations where they're saying, well, I don't care about strategy. And I'm like, I get that you are not being asked to think and operate strategically right now. But if you're going to tell me that you don't care about it, you're going to be a worse operator, right? That's like, you know your stuff really well. What I'm trying to get you to do is think about all the way up the chain so that you can better understand your commander's intent on a day-to-day basis. Not just plan on being the next admiral. Understand the admiral's mind now is going to make you a better tactician and operator. So that's a good point. That tension, the way that one of the ways that tension manifests in today's, I would argue, in some of today's military, professional military education. But one of the interesting things that I want to point out with the legacy of Clausewitz and the way that one of the turning points, it's actually the Vietnam War. It's not the only turning point. Clausewitz is the other turning point that I would isolate is the Franco-Prussian Wars, in which Bismarck is incredibly successful, and people start looking for one of the reasons why the Prussian military is so successful. And the reason that they isolate there is they're reading Clausewitz and not just Jomini. And so let's try and explain and explore what this new theorist who has been around in German circles for a while. But the other one, the Vietnam, is important here because this is where the American system that has been largely steeped in Jominian approaches struggles significantly. And one of the very quick reasons why we say the American system struggled is because we did not understand the proper relationship between politics and military goals. And that's what Clausewitz talks about.
Good point. Also on the Civil War piece of it, Jomini is still alive during the U.S. Civil War. And I think a lot of U.S. Army cadets studied Napoleon at West Point and tried to apply those principles. And it didn't necessarily, that's 50 years after Napoleon. So those principles don't always work the same way.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. That's been the waxing and the waning of Jomini, right? Where people will say that, right? And I think accurately say that. Be like, well, this guy was a Napoleonic thinker, what good is he for the Civil War? What good is he for the World Wars? What good is he for the Cold War? And what good is he for the post-Cold War? He is not relevant for a post-Cold War era. I don't fully agree with that. I understand the sentiment, but I also would argue that the ideas of concentration of force and logistics, and even if it's not the specifics of how Jomini is thinking you're going to win a battle, that checklist modernized to the present day is actually still quite useful. And I think we lose something by ignoring the Jominian approach to war. The actual specifics needs to be maybe updated to a modern day or to whatever day in which you're using it, but it can be updated. The reason why Clausewitz is more famous right now is that Clausewitz doesn't really need to be updated that much. He is so ephemeral. He's kind of like just talking in these general ideas that it's so easy to say, yeah, concentrate force. What does that look like? Does that look like drones, carriers? Does it look like cyber? Like, what does that look like? It's going to look different, but the principle remains the same. The idea and the situation in which we're operating remains the same. Culminating points. How do you know when you've lost or won?
Yeah, I think those are all great points, and it goes back to like why are tech leaders in Silicon Valley reading about Napoleon? Well, he got rid of old systems that didn't work, and he figured out a replicable system where he won and won and won over and over again. So I think that's why he's still applicable to this day.
Absolutely. And the other element that I think is relevant there is leadership, right? Napoleon knew how to lead. And so then Jomini and Clausewitz both kind of come at that same observation of this man was an amazing leader. How do we distill translatable something that we can put into a textbook or put into a military academy or put into a boardroom? How do we take those essences of leadership and apply them? Both are trying to do that, and that's what we still try to do today, is try to understand how we can translate what he did to our world.
Yeah, and I'm glad you hit upon that last part, the leadership part of it. Like, he knew how to talk to the general foot soldier and management by walking around, share a meal with them, but he also knew how to inspire his generals and marshals to work harder and do things that no one else had done before.
And he was an operator, right? Napoleon knew what was going on the battlefield. He was not a pie in the sky thinker, right? He was not Jomini and Clausewitz. He knew what war took. He had his checklist. He had all of this idea of the nitty gritty technical dimensions of war that Jomini would say, that's what makes Napoleon so great. That's part of what makes Napoleon so great, but that's not all of what Napoleon had, right? He had that system and he had those technical checklists, but he also had that commander's eye. And that's, I think, where when he talks to the marshals, when he engages with the marshals, the reason why they follow him is not because he knows everything on the battlefield. It's because they're like, I didn't see that. Right? I didn't see that. You did, and that's why you're in charge.
Right. And, Wellington said, his hat's worth 40,000 men. The morale of the army went up. The marshals knew that he was going to put them in the right place to win. There was a lot to his leadership.
Absolutely. Yep. The trust, right? Trust that this is someone who knows what he's doing and how to inculcate that.
Okay. Final question. I'm not going to hold you to it. Who do you like better, Jomini or Clausewitz?
I have an answer to that. I've tried to play both sides, right? I've tried to kind of give a fair accounting, but I'm a Clausewitzian guy. I think that ultimately, and I say that on two different levels. One is, as an educator, I find Clausewitz significantly more useful in the classroom. I like to ask thought-provoking questions, and Clausewitz is fantastic for asking thought-provoking questions and watching students wrestle. And me being able to say like, well, and then I throw something else at them, that's so good, and I think it's valuable. And Jomini doesn't really give me that. I can almost do a multiple choice test to see the light go on for students with Jomini, and I like a fluid classroom environment. But I also like Clausewitz because I am relatively convinced by the idea that he is easier to apply to a myriad of situations. And because he's more difficult to apply in some ways, he's more malleable, less rigid. And that malleability, I think, is critical for today. It's critical for us understanding the past and understanding and using that historical analysis aspect of it. But it's also critical for military thinkers today to not be caught off guard when something shows up on their checklist that wasn't there yesterday.
I think that's a great point. I tried to read Marshall Marmont's book on war, and basically his memoirs. And it was kind of a technical manual. It was almost like too dense to read, and I wasn't getting a lot out of it. And I think Clausewitz, you get more, like you said, theory and stuff that makes you think. It's not just like a field manual.
It's not a field manual, and again, we live in a rapidly changing environment that Clausewitz is not a perfect fit for. One of the things I always tell my students is, we read Sun Tzu, we read Clausewitz, I allude to Jomini, we read a little bit of Little Hart, we read a little bit of a few other theorists that we might include. I love theory, so I'll always try to throw more at them. But I always say, hey, we just talked about a bunch of dead guys, right? Like, they're all, like, what is one of the defining characteristic of a military theorist? They're dead, right? And that's problematic in some ways, that we need to at least be aware of who is writing at the time, which is or who is writing at our time and who is writing for our time. So to go back to one of the things that Jomini does so well is, he's a theorist that is respected and understood and engaged with in his time. And that allows him to be flexible. It allows him to shape. It allows him to be an active participant in the military culture of multiple generations, really. And that's hard to quantify, the value of being alive and being a thinker.
Maybe one of the students in your class is the next, critical thinker and genius, like, the next Stephen Ambrose or of this generation. Like, who's a military historian that's going to be pushing these ideas forward 80 years from now?
Absolutely. And at the Naval War College, we go back to Admiral James Stockdale, Stockdale, but also Stansfield Turner. Both of those, they are thinkers, and they were admirals, right? They're admirals who were thinkers, who would talk about the books that you've read and talk about the ideas that you've engaged with, and the way that makes you better on the battlefield and better able to win. Does that mean that you should not read Jomini? No, that means you should read Jomini, right? You should read Jomini so that you can engage with those ideas. Yes, maybe recognize the more technical aspects of it, but it's one of those old dictums, beware the man of one book. And I think that's one of the dangers of Clausewitz and his preponderance of authority in the modern professional military education circles, is the one book. And it's like, we need to go beyond Clausewitz, and Jomini is a important and critical counterpoint to that.
Yeah, or Sun Tzu or Machiavelli or any of the old books.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, my friend. Well, again, Josh, thanks for joining us. If you want to check out Josh, he has 2 books on Amazon that I highly recommend. And we were thrilled to have him on the show. This was fantastic.
Had a blast as well. Hopefully we, I want to convince people of the relevance of some of these theorists, right? It's not just, I will say, trying to read Clausewitz, I'm not going to go out and say, go read Clausewitz, because that, like, read snippets. And I know that's bad form, right? But it is hard to read sometimes. But engage with it. Engage with the ideas, engage with the principles, and we'll better understand the Napoleonic era and our own at the same time through looking at theory like this.
Amen.